Hi everybody, don't touch that dial. This is the Hank Cisco Show. I'm Stan Casaccio sitting in for Hank Cisco. Got a great show for you today, especially those of you who love historical buildings and a little bit of history. We have Ira Poliakoff here, who's the author of two great books. I'll show you the one we're going to discuss today, Synagogues of Philadelphia, but he's also done the Synagogues of Long Island, which means he's not a Flyers fan, a Philly fan, or an Eagles fan. At least I don't think so.
Well, it's partially true, Stan. First of all, I want to thank you for having me on your show today. But I am a Phillies fan. I gave up on the Mets when my son was born, and I had to take him to games. And living in Philadelphia, I felt he should grow up a Phillies fan, so I did switch to the Phillies. But I'm still a New York fan for other sports.
Well, we'll let you continue this conversation since you're at least a Phillies fan, so we won't throw you out. Anyhow. One other thing I have to mention, I got to meet Ira's beautiful wife the other day, and she's a retired high school teacher, and she's definitely an angel. I can just tell by talking to her she's a great person, and she's a saint because she's married to you,
That's
right?
True. That's true, Stan.
So anyhow, you were born not in Philadelphia, you were born on Long Island. So tell me a little bit about, what it was like growing up on Long Island in your neighborhood. I'm sure it was very ethnic, as many of those communities are. So give us a little background about that.
Okay. All right. So, Stan, I was born right at the end of World War II in 1945. And that was during the great migration of ethnic families from the boroughs of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, out to what was then the horse pastures of Long Island. Prior to World War II, Long Island had very few Jews, very few Catholics. It was primarily native white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. After World War II, all the soldiers came home, again, many of them Italian and many of them Jewish, to the five boroughs, and they were looking for a couple of things. First of all, they were looking for a sweetheart to marry because they'd just gotten out of 4 years of naval or army service. Second, they were looking for a little piece of I like to call the suburban pie, a little grass behind their home instead of living in a 40-story apartment building like they did in the city. And lastly, I think a lot of them were looking for a different type of religion. Whether they were Catholic or Jewish, they were looking for possibly something a little bit more liberal than they were brought up with, because many of them were brought up in religious homes where religion was all-consuming. It was really 23 out of 24 hours a day. And of course, in the Jewish religion, this gave birth to what we call today the more liberal synagogues, conservative synagogues, reform synagogues,
right.
Exactly.
Right. So in those neighborhoods, obviously, one of the things that I've noticed, and the book is very detailed in background, but the thing I saw about it, that's the theme through it, is the fact that synagogues were formed by communities. Now, I'll preface it by saying, as a Catholic, the diocese would establish a church or a community. Pastors would become the Protestants or the Baptists or anything, and they would establish a church, and that was their group. It was less likely to move because of the established neighborhoods. So whatever the ethnicity of that particular community, as long as there were Catholics or Protestants or Baptists, they kind of stayed in that church. Where, as opposed to the synagogue, you have a community of people, which is really interesting, who start meeting in their house, and they say, well, let's form a synagogue. And then why don't you kind of go through that process that you kind of as a theme throughout the book, how these people would get together?
Well, I'll give you a good example because I'm very familiar with it, and that's the synagogue up in Pottstown, not far from here at all. The synagogue is called Congregation Mercy and Truth. In Hebrew, that's Chesed Shel Emet. And this congregation started really being founded in the late 1890s. And what happened was there were about 30 Jewish families in the Pottstown area. Most of them were merchants at that point in time, because Pottstown was one of these, what we call the outer ring original suburbs. It was one of the suburbs that existed back in the late 1800s, had stores, Trade took place there. The doctor's office was there. The post office was there. That type of thing. Whereas many of the towns surrounding it, hardly existed. Places like Collegeville and Oaks and Phoenixville hardly existed in those days. So these 30 families started meeting in various members' homes on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays. They took turns leading the service because most of them had come from Europe, where they had attended Jewish schools, what we call yeshivas, where the combination of Jewish and secular education takes place in one school. So they were very well equipped to lead the services in the same manner that a rabbi does today. And then slowly they developed enough money. They started first by building a cemetery, and they built the Pottstown Jewish Cemetery. Then they formed what they called a burial society, because in those days people didn't use funeral directors. Each religious group would bury their own, so to speak, and each has their own tradition, a way of doing it. So the Jews of Pottstown formed the Pottstown Burial Society, buried their own, and then by 1910 they had their first synagogue, a very small building. In the 20s they moved to a second building, and now they're in their third building, which they built in the early 50s on Keim Street in Pottstown.
So it went from 30 families to several hundred families today, I
I'll
assume.
tell you, here's the sad thing. It went from 30 families to several hundred families. It's back down because now Pottstown is changing again. It's back down to less than 100 families.
Interesting.
But it's a great example if you want to study a synagogue. And they were very smart about 2 years ago when they saw the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. They sold the building to a church, one that they knew had the means to maintain the building. They took the money that they got for the building and put it into an account that draws interest. They used that to pay rent to the church for the small part of the building that they really need and to pay their rabbi. So it's a win-win for the church, for the rabbi, for the synagogue, and when the time comes that the membership is just so low that they can't maintain it anymore, so then they'll merge into one of the nearby synagogues to them, Phoenixville or Bluebell, one of the other synagogues up.
Now, I understand that in the Jewish faith and Jewish tradition and everything, that you don't really need a rabbi. You just need X number of men. I think there was X number, but now I'm sure they include women now in many of the Reform synagogues. I guess the old school still believe in that, because I know that the real Orthodox Jews are extremely separated in gender-related stuff. But that's true. You just need X number of people.
You just need, in Reform and Conservative synagogues, you need 10 men or women. Of course, in Orthodox, as you said, 10 men.
10 men. And that's what, so realistically, these communities that formed around these synagogues are really family-based and community-based, as opposed to a diocese saying, okay, we're going to plunk something down here and something down here. This was really nurtured from the spirit of the people that were in that community.
Very true. And most of them were either geocentric, which means that the people there probably came from the same place in Europe, or Spain or Portugal, or they were ethnocentric, which means that they not only came from the same place, but they came from a small part of it. For example, there was a famous synagogue in Philadelphia that was called Adshe Lublin, which meant that they were from Lublin in Poland. Everybody who went to that synagogue, even if they didn't live right nearby, they walked because they wanted to be where there were people from their hometown in Europe.
Hometown in Europe. So here you are growing up in this community that basically I'm sure was Italian and Jews for the most part.
100% almost.
There's something about that. I always kid people that the Italians, the Romans occupied Israel for about 200 years, and we were very big into doing a bunch of stuff. So I'm sure there might be a little Italian blood in you. I don't know about that. But in any event, so you're in these communities, and you grow up in this, and I'm sure from knowing you a little bit, there was a lot of tradition in the Jewish religion, and there was a lot of tradition in your family. Although I think you told me your dad wasn't real big into it, but your mom was like,
yes,
every Saturday you were there on Sabbath and the high holy days and everything else like that, and that's what kind of she imparted that to you. in
That's
a
true.
big way. So give me that relation between you and your mom and how that worked.
Okay. Well, first of all, what's interesting about my mom is she was born in 1922. Okay. She was born just about the time that conservative Judaism was founded. So in other words, her parents were brought up Orthodox. But for some reason, her parents embraced conservative Judaism from the minute a conservative synagogue was thought to be founded in her neighborhood. In other words, it was still in the thought process. And so she grew up conservative, which was, most of my friends' parents grew up Orthodox. So she grew up conservative all the way. My grandparents were conservative all the way. So when we moved to Rockville Center, there were three choices, really. There was a Reform congregation, a conservative congregation, and there was still a very traditional right-wing Orthodox congregation. So she chose, my father could have cared less, I have to be honest with you. My father was a physician, he worked on the Sabbath, and he only went to synagogue when my mother would, hit him over the head with a frying pan.
Yeah, drag him out. Kind of like our family, but that's okay, go ahead.
But at any rate, but every Saturday morning, my mother would walk with me, make me walk with her, because when you get to be, early teens already, you don't want to go every week. I'm sure you have that in every religion.
Yeah, I'm sure.
You want to be with the girls, or you want to play ball with
And
the
you don't
guys.
be walking with your mother, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Well, I have to tell you honestly, and this is the truth, and you can ask my sister, until I graduated high school, every Saturday morning just about, we walked. Plus, on the Jewish holidays that required that, that you don't drive, we walked and we went to synagogue, and that's how I was brought up. The home was strictly kosher, although we did eat out, I have to be honest with you, in restaurants. But in the house, we followed the Jewish kosher laws.
And you still do today, from what I
Yes,
understand,
my wife does.
in your
Yes.
house, yes.
Yes, my wife does. And my daughter does as well.
Mm-hmm. So anyhow, so now you had your own business, and you were a fairly successful small businessman. There was something you did that was quite unique in the Philadelphia area, and I think you should let the listeners know, because it all started with this guy in the Philadelphia area. So,
Well, I don't want to take the credit, but I guess it's a little over 40 years ago. I had a small business where we provided back office services to banks. In other words, services that real small banks, it didn't make sense for them to hire the people and to buy the equipment to provide the service. So we provided the service in their name. So one of the services very early on were Visa and Visa debit cards. Now, my small company that I owned at that time, which I eventually sold to Beneficial Bank, which is now part of WSFS Bank.
Yeah. You need a scorecard to track all these banks out.
We were one of the first licensees of Visa, which at that time was called Bank AmeriCard. Mm-hmm. So we were a licensee of Bank AmeriCard, which was Bank of America in California. And we were the first licensee in the Philadelphia area and one of the first licensees nationally.
That's pretty impressive, doing that.
It was a nothing business at that time. God, do I wish I was in it today.
Yeah, right. So anyhow, so you're doing that, and then you sell your business and you're retired, and you're saying, what am I going to do? I think I'll start writing books, right?
Well, it's not quite like that. What happened was I sold my business in 11 years ago, so that would be 2008. I also had my first granddaughter in 2008, about literally a month or two afterwards. One day when she was about 6 or 7, I was walking down 6th Street in Philadelphia, right around South Street. And we passed by this huge old building, which was actually serving as believe it or not, an antique store. But my granddaughter noticed up on the top of the building, engraved into the cement, were Jewish symbols. There was a 6-pointed star. There was the menorah, which is a candelabra that's used on our holiday Hanukkah. Different symbols of Judaism were in the building. And she said to me, "Popsy," that's what she called me, Popsy, "why are there Jewish symbols in this building that's serving as an antique store?" Well, fortunately, I knew the answer, and I told her that this building was originally the Great Romanian Synagogue of Philadelphia. It was called B'nai Abraham. It was on South 6th Street. And in 1959, as the neighborhood changed and the members moved out, out from that part of Philadelphia into Montgomery County, Bucks County, Delaware County, the synagogue sold the building, and this is what it was today. Well, it was for her contemporaries, and their children and grandchildren that I wrote both the two books that I've written so far.
So that was the impetus for
Absolutely.
you to begin researching, which, from knowing you a little bit, you have this historical bent with you, and so it was an easy thing saying, hey, you know what, this could be an interesting thing to do. And I found your book quite interesting, just and going and said, oh, I saw that building. Oh, yeah. In fact, I earmarked this thing a couple places, and I'm looking. There was a building in Cheltenham, which was where I went for my first bar mitzvah event when I was a kid, and of course it's been demolished now.
Sure.
But I go, wow, I knew that building. I was there back in the late '50s for my first bar mitzvah. I'll never forget my first bar mitzvah. I said, wow, this is fun. I think I might convert. You know? So in any event, so you get that from your granddaughter, which is really a great story. And then you really turn to your neighborhood that you came from, Long Island, because of your relationship with Long Island. And you decided to do the work to find out about the different synagogues there. One thing I noticed throughout the book is most of the synagogues, at least on the East Coast, and we'll get into the older ones in a little bit, because I'm going to ask you about that, because I think people will be really interested to know which is the oldest synagogue in the United States. But most of them are less than 125 years old. In fact, I would say the vast majority of them probably since 1930s that so many have been built and moved in a couple of times and things like that. So tell me what it was like going back to Long Island and doing the research on these synagogues.
Well, it was quite interesting, Stan, because one of the things about Long Island is it is a great example of how each generation an area changes. For example, in 1940, before World War II, there were 30,000 Jews in all of Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk counties.
Out of a population
Out of a population at that point in time, 2 million.
2 million.
Okay.
30,000.
Which is not a lot.
No, I would say not.
In 1950, only 5 years after World War II, 400,000, 12 times. Could you believe that?
From 30,000
to 400,000. And almost all of them moved there between 1946 and 1950. So that's why there were so many of the synagogues, as you mentioned before, were built right after World War II.
Is there a reason for that? It wasn't all people having babies, that's for sure.
No. I think the reason was, as I said before, when the servicemen got home, you know, they had seen a lot. There's no question about it. To have served in World War II must have been just awful.
Greatest generation.
I know you were in the service. I was in the service.
Greatest generation.
We didn't see anything like what these guys saw.
No.
You know, in our service time. So they came back, and I think they decided that number one, they wanted a little bit of suburbia. They wanted a little bit of you know, finding a wife to settle down with and have a family, you know, so that maybe they could forget these horrible memories they had of the war. And number three, I think they honestly wanted a more liberal look at the religious life that they had had. And that's not only the Jews, as I said before, because I think the Catholic churches are much more liberal today than they were in 1930.
I can vouch for that. Yeah,
Okay,
I can
so
vouch
you
for
know
that.
that.
Yeah,
Right,
I can vouch for that.
Right, so I think that's the reason the population grew so much.
So basically they came from the New York tenement buildings and things of that nature and moved out there for the better life.
Right. But what happened was, what's interesting, from a high of about 440,000 Jews on Long Island, which was around 1963 or so, which was when I was in college, to the present day, it's down to 300,000. So we've lost almost 150,000. So where did they go and who replaced them? Well, where they went was all over the country, because we now have a mobile society. Today, it's not at all unusual for a kid from, say, Norristown, where we are today, to go to college in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. In our day, if you went to college and you lived in Philadelphia, you went to Temple, you went to Villanova, you went to LaSalle, and that was it. If you lived in New York, you went to City College of New York,
Hofstra.
you know, a Hofstra or a Delphi, you know, that was it. But today, these kids, they can go anywhere. Mm-hmm. The society is so mobile. So a lot of kids moved out and never came back. A lot intermarried, which means they were lost to their home religion, because they may have chosen to adopt the religion, of the new spouse,
of the spouse, yeah, one way or the
or
other.
no religion. That happens sometimes too. So what was interesting was, so when I started writing the book, by then already 50 or 60 of the synagogues had closed or merged into others because the neighborhood had changed so much, because we were into the next generation of, we have a word in Hebrew, olim chadashim, that means new immigrants. So the new immigrants had come to Long Island to replace the earlier group of Catholics and Jews that came there. So now we saw a tremendous amount of really high quality Spanish American immigrants and a lot of Asian American immigrants. So those neighborhoods that were either Italian or Jewish, so today are Asian or Spanish. And I suspect in 60 years, it'll be another group of new immigrants.
So let's talk about the Long Island and the synagogues. So we were talking about how that at one time before the 1940s there was only 30,000 Jewish families, and then by 1950 there was 400,000 Jewish families because they moved from some of the tenements and stuff like that in New York City to get a little piece of the grass out there in Long Island.
Right.
And so how does that work in with the community and where you lived and everything else? Because you were part of that expansion mode.
Exactly. I suspect there were probably only a few hundred Jewish families in my hometown, which was Rockville Center, Long Island. Population around 30,000. There were probably 200 Jews prior to the end of World War II. By 1950, we had built 2 humongous synagogues, a Reform and a Conservative, and 1 small synagogue, a right-wing Orthodox synagogue.
Okay.
I went to public high school. My high school graduating class was about 400. I suspect 300 were Jews. The other 197 were Catholics, and 3 were
Probably Italian.
for the most part, yes. A few Irish, but for the most part Italian, and maybe three kids that were not either Italian or Jewish. Now, by the time my sister graduated 7 years later, we started to develop an African American population as well, and a large AME Baptist Church was formed in Rockville Center as well.
Okay.
So of course today it's changed completely. As I said before,
a lot of Hispanic.
Rockville Center is more Catholic. What happened was the Archdiocese of Brooklyn decided to split into 2 dioceses, Brooklyn and Rockville Center.
Oh, okay.
And when the church in Rockville Center became a cathedral, many of our Catholic brethren wanted to move to be near the cathedral. Oh. So as Jewish families moved out, now Catholic families moved in, and actually today Rockville Center is about 75% Catholic.
Interesting.
Strangely enough.
So now you have all these synagogues being developed during those times. As I said, it seems to me when I went through the book that most of the synagogues are less than 100 years old in this country. And we'll get into the older ones later on, the first ones, but I think people will be real interested in those. So give me a little bit of background so now we have these expanding Jewish populations, people are getting together and they're starting their own synagogues. They don't just get up one morning and say, we're going to start a synagogue. How does that?
I'll give you a good example in Philadelphia. So I happen to live in Lower Merion Township. So in 1945, there were about 200 Jewish people, not families, people in Lower Merion Township, in the entire township. In fact, it had one of those reputations where if you were Jewish or Catholic or African American, that you weren't welcome. Strange, seriously, as late as 1945.
Yeah.
Now 1945 ends, the servicemen all come home. Many of them grew up in the ethnic neighborhoods of Philadelphia, like Strawberry Mansion, North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. I could go on and on and on.
Northern Liberties.
And as you said before, Stan, they were looking for their piece of the suburban grass, a little bit of, a little bit different environment. So now in Lower Merion, this is now almost 100 years after the end of the Great War, we have 14 bricks and mortar, that means real buildings, synagogues, in our little township of 60,000 people.
Wow.
Lower Merion is now 50% Jewish. Then it was less than a half of 1%.
1%. And so the people who established these different ones, how would people get together?
I'll give you a good example, my own synagogue. And if you show the cover of the book again, Stan, you see the one on the top. That's Temple Beth Hillel Beth El, which is on Lancaster Avenue in Wynwood, part of Lower Merion Township.
I know the building.
Okay. It was formed rather late on as far as local synagogues go in 1958. So what happened was there was already a conservative synagogue in Lower Merion called the Temple Adath Israel, which was located on Montgomery Avenue right near the city line, and it's still there today. But more and more Jews were moving to what we call the western end of Lower Merion Township, which would be Wynwood, Haverford, that area, even the lower part of Villanova, on the borderline of Delaware County. And they started meeting. There were 30 families placed an ad in the mainline Times looking for other like-minded families that wanted to meet with them. And they started meeting the first year, a combination of members' homes and the landlord who owned the Wynwood Shopping Center, Harry Kravitz, was one of them. And Harry let them use an empty store when they had a large crowd. A large crowd would be 60 or 70 people. You know, they'd bring rental chairs. Right, the first year. The second year, the Strawbridge estate on the corner of Lancaster and Remington went up for sale. They couldn't afford to buy it, but they rented it for 2 years. They came to a rental agreement with them. And then by the end of the rental agreement, they had enough money for a down payment. Plus, they had a member who was on the board of a specific bank that was going to give them the mortgage because he was on the board, and they were able to buy the building. But they started, as you said before, in members' homes, 30 families, and the reason we joined was because one of those 30 women taught with my wife. Both taught math together, and when we decided to move to Lower Merion, she insisted that we join that synagogue. We didn't have a chance to join anyplace else. She dragged us there, a couple of Friday nights and a couple of Saturdays, and, we were hooked. And we're very glad that we did.
Yeah, I'm sure you found many like-minded people there. Right. So, which is really the interesting thing about this tradition that surrounds these shuls and the synagogues and things like that. They're very family-oriented, very much the same people, pretty much in the same mold of thinking to a degree about their God and religion and stuff like that. And it makes for a unique situation. Now, let's get into some of the oldest synagogues in the United States. I was blown away when you gave me this statistic that before 1800 there were only 7 synagogues on the mainland. So let's go through them. Number one, the oldest synagogue in the country was in New York. No. But everybody thinks so. Everybody thinks so, but that's not the case.
The first synagogue founded in the United States, which goes back to very early 1730s, actually, was the Touro Synagogue, which is located in Rhode Island, of all places. The second was Congregation Shirat Yisroel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Manhattan, New York.
So that would be the Sephardic Jews that came over, getting away from the leftovers of the what do you call it? The Inquisition, all that stuff.
Jews were never comfortable in Spain after the Inquisition, right? And some came from Portugal. Mm-hmm. The third synagogue, which was also Sephardic, was Congregation Mikveh Israel, 44 North 4th Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
44 North Broad Street.
4th Street.
4th Street.
That's the current location. That's the 5th building they've been in since they were founded in 1740.
1740.
Okay. The other 4 colonial synagogues, I call them colonial because it means they were founded 1799 or earlier. Mm-hmm. The other 4 are the Lloyd Street Synagogue in Baltimore, the Congregation Beth Abba in Richmond, Virginia, and the synagogues in both Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. It's interesting to note that in 1800, there were more Jews in Charleston, South Carolina, than any other city in the United States.
Interestingly enough, that during the Civil War, Jefferson Davis's finance or treasurer was a Jewish person from Richmond, Virginia. which was interesting. Now, I will tell you this, when I go to Charleston the next time, which my daughter lives in Charleston, I'm definitely going to see if I can which you have to tell me where that's located at.
I have it at home. I will give you the information.
You'll have to, because I'd like to.
And they have tours every day.
I would like to go see that building because I've been through. Charleston's a wonderful
Great
town.
city.
Great city. The people are wonderful there. It's a very. I love going there. I really do, and they're very open. But I want to go visit that building to see it because it's kind of like going back in time. Anyhow, so we got the 7 that are there. Tell us a little bit more about the Philadelphia, the old the Philadelphia, and then I want to get into, before the show's over, I want people to know where you're going to be speaking at, because I think they'll find it very enlightening. Just tell me a little bit about Philadelphia.
Okay, the first synagogue, as I said, in Philadelphia, 1740, was the Congregation Mikveh Israel. It was founded on Cherry Street, but now, as I said, they're on 44 North 4th Street, which is the 5th building they've been in. It's a long time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
They
were from a particular area of the old world?
most of them came from Barcelona, strangely enough.
Oh, really?
Right,
Oh, so
yeah.
okay.
Right. It was what you called the Sephardic, correctly, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. The next 2 synagogues in Philadelphia were Congregation Knesset Israel, commonly known as KI.
Right.
Exactly. Now located on Old York Road in Elkins Park, but it goes way back to 5 different buildings in Philadelphia. And the other was the Congregation Road of Sholem, still in Philadelphia at Broad and Wallace, in their 2nd building on the same site. Their first building, by the way, was the only synagogue ever designed by Frank Furness, very famous architect. I know you're familiar with architects, so you know about him. But he designed a lot of grand churches as well as the first Road of Sholem building.
One of the ones that I know we want to just touch on briefly is 2 of the ones. First, on a personal basis, was the Germantown Jewish Community Center on Lincoln Drive, which my father was the general contractor for. And many years later, I went to a bar mitzvah. One of my friends who grew up, and his son was getting bar mitzvahed. And there was an old guy who was on the board. I got introduced to him, and he remembered my father as one of the greatest builders, because he did anytime they asked him to do anything, he did it. And so there's the little history there on that building. It means a lot when I go see that, and I know my father worked on that building. And that has an interesting little history, too.
Yeah, well, he should be very proud of that building, because there's a lot of very intricate stonework on it.
Yes.
So the work that he did was of the highest quality.
Yeah,
There's
my
no
father
question.
was could actually sculpture stone.
Yeah.
And in our office we have a fireplace, massive fireplace that he carved out of stone. Then the other one is the Frank Lloyd Wright Synagogue on Old York Road, that's shaped like a temple. Yep, there it is right there on this scene right here, as you can see. And tell us a little bit about the history of that. How did they pick Frank Lloyd Wright? And
it's a very interesting story. All right. So in 1949, they have a nice building, this synagogue. It's called Congregation Beth Sholem. They have a nice building on the, I forget what 100, North Broad Street in Philadelphia. But they see their members are starting to move north up to Cheltenham and Elkins Park and Hamilton, and they realize that they have to do something. They have to move. They have to sell the building and move. So the rabbi at that time was a gentleman by the name of Rabbi Mortimer Cohen. Now, if you think your rabbi or your priest has an ego, you should have seen the ego in this guy. This guy, I mean, all he wanted to do was speak and stand up to the microphone and hold his jacket. He had a great ego. So he convinced the board to let him try to get Frank Lloyd Wright to do the synagogue. Money wasn't a big issue. They had a lot of wealthy members at that time. The board said, all right. So he calls Wright. He gets Wright to come into Philadelphia and to have a meeting with him, and he explains to Wright how he's going to give him free reign. He can do whatever he wants. All he's going to do is give him spiritual guidance. In other words, guidance as to how the certain religious aspects of the building are designed. In other words, that a holy ark has to be a certain way, just as in any type of church, there are certain parts that have to be.
Right.
So Wright reluctantly agrees. He takes the commission, and they fight like cats and dogs for 3 years, and the result is the current building.
That's an interesting story. That's an interesting story. So I do want to, I think the show's getting ready to to wrap up, but I want to know you're going to be doing some speaking engagements, which you've done in the past, and
Correct.
these are really enlightening. If you think this conversation was great, come see Ira speak, and you'll enjoy it. So where's your next stop?
Okay, on Thursday night, May 2nd, I'll be at the Jeans Public Library on Joshua Road in Lafayette Hill.
Right.
Coming up also, let me see here, in this area, I'll be at the Norristown, the Montgomery County Norristown Public Library on Powell Street, and that will be on Tuesday, June 4th. And on Saturday, June 19th, I'll be at the Synagogue Congregation Chesed Shel Emet on Keim Street in Pottstown. You can hear me and you can buy the book there. And if you can't attend and want to buy the book, you can buy it locally at the Montgomery County Historical Society right here in Norristown on DeKalb Street.
So again, there's the dates, and it'll come up on the screen too, I'm sure. Ira, I would like to thank you very much for coming in and talking about some of the buildings in Philadelphia and the synagogues that we've have seen growing up. In my first bar mitzvah, going to one of the synagogues. I've actually been to bar mitzvahs at KI and the Frank Lloyd Wright, and I've enjoyed my time there. So thank you very much for coming out. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next week. This is Stan Casasio signing off for Hank Cisco, and just remember, if you want to walk on water, know where the rocks are. Talk to you later.